So what I'm going to do today is kind of ground my time around two questions. I'll do the first one really quickly. I know there are some people in the audience. Christina's heard this probably like 5 times now, so act interested and laugh at all the right places. That would be my request since you're in the front row and I can see you. Give you a little bit of a better sense around kind of what framing is and why it matters, why I think it matters in the work that you all are doing, and then move fairly quickly to dig into the work that we've been doing with the partners for the last, I'm going to go with 1.5 years. But I want to start by giving you a little bit of background around this work more generally and why it matters. So I'm going to go through 3 answers to the first question that you see on the screen, why does framing matter? And the first answer, and I think this has been said already in a couple of different ways, is that if we are trying to create sustained social change, at some level we have to be interested and concerned in culture change. There has rarely, if ever, been an issue that has changed in a meaningful, deep, and sustained way that has not involved and implicated culture change at some level. And so if you don't believe me, I have 2 kind of what I think are particularly eloquent quotes that illustrate this. One from a former president of my country, who said, people have maybe seen this quote before, but it's one of my all-time favorites in terms of kind of public thinking and framing, that public sentiment is everything. With it, nothing can fail. Against it, nothing can succeed. Whoever molds public sentiment goes deeper than he who enacts statutes or pronounces judicial decisions. And just so we're kind of equal opportunity in our quoting on both sides of the pond, another one of my favorites is from Marianne Evans, writing under the pen name of George Eliot, who said, I'll tell you, what's the greatest power under heaven, and that is public opinion, the ruling belief in society about what is right and what is wrong, what is honorable and what is shameful. That's the steam that is to work the engines. So the work that we do is really guided by the following theory of change, which is that if you can change the way that a group of people, a field, a sector, frames their issue, if you can change the way that they are communicating, over time, with enough of the kind of right messages going out through the right channels, from the right people to the right people, you can actually change the larger public discourse of an issue. If you're able to change that public discourse, the kind of information air that we are breathing, you can, over time, in really deep and meaningful ways, change the way that people think. You can change culture and how it informs and shapes attitudes, beliefs, and thinking. That if you change public thinking, you create the space, and not only create the space, but put pressure behind those who are in policy-making positions to be able to have to, make different decisions in those positions that they are in. So, as I said before, we work with a lot of people who bypass these middle 2 things, kind of don't really worry about people, about the public, about thinking, and their strategy is go right from a field right to policymakers. And I think my argument to that perspective is not that it's not important, but if that is all you ever do, you will keep doing it and keep doing it and keep doing it forever. As new policymakers come in, as new governments come in, you will continually have to do that. And all of your change is forever at risk of being cut, dropped, rescinded, changed, if you are not concerned with culture and public thinking. So we ran a bunch of studies, which I will spare you all of except for one. One particular experiment, which I think is really interesting in making this point that understanding is frame dependent. So this is a large experiment. It's about 4,500 Americans selected to be representative along kind of all the categories that you would think are important: age, race, gender, political ideology, education, wealth, residential location, probably forgetting a couple, but that's the gist. And each of those 4,500 people is assigned randomly to hear a different message. In this case, the messages that people are hearing are along the horizontal axis here. If everyone can see them at the bottom of the screen, I'll tell you what they are. And so here's how it works. Christine, you're part of the experiment. Lucky you today. You are randomly assigned, and you get the value of future progress and social prosperity. You would read a message that looks like something like a newspaper article. It's got a headline, body, and a pullout. And it would say something like, addressing child mental health is important because the stability of children's mental health is essential to the future progress of our country. It's essential to the kind of collective prosperity of our society. So we need to do a better job on this issue. Ben, you log on, you get vulnerability. Yes, yes. Which is the sense that we need to do better on this issue because children are our most vulnerable citizens. They deserve our empathy, warrant our compassion, and therefore we really need to take this on. This is important. Heather, you log on, lucky you, you get nothing. You're the control condition. You get no message. You are, unfortunately, you are zero. You are the zero line, I'm sorry. I know you, so I can pick on you a little bit. It's okay. And so then all of you answer the same set of questions that are designed to kind of determine how supportive you are of this set of policies, how salient, how important you think this issue is. So what you're going to see on the next click are what I normally say are two beautiful green bars, but they're not going to be green, so they're just beautiful. They're beautiful bars, and what the two bars are going to show you is the degree to which hearing those different messages affects people's support for that set of evidence-based policies. So I don't know how statistically inclined you are as an audience, so here's your quick statistics lesson. Up is good, down is bad. And so what you're seeing here, you're seeing two bars, I guess they're gray, and you're noticing two things. So first of all, Christine's value is having a positive effect on people's support for those evidence-based policies. It's making people more willing to get behind them, endorse them, support them. That's the good news. The bad news is that Ben's value, vulnerability, sorry Ben, is having the opposite effect. So it is having a negative effect. It is depressing people's support for this set of evidence-based policies. So if you are an expert or an advocate or a researcher on child mental health in the United States, and you are using this value to frame your messages, you actually make people, to a statistically significant degree, less willing to support the very things for which you are advocating. So the really interesting thing is that in a subsequent piece of analysis where we looked at all of the fields, so there's a pretty robust field of child mental health advocates in the United States. When we looked at their materials, guess which value is used in over 87% of those materials? It's not a rhetorical question. Someone, vulnerability, right? So in essence, what they've been doing for a very long time, with what in retrospect is quite a bit of money, is driving a value that not only is wasting those resources, but is actually moving people in the opposite direction. We're going to dig into those cultural models now. I'm going to start by kind of showing you an overview of the primary assumptions that people draw on when they are asked to answer open-ended questions about the care system and those with experience with it and what we could do to fix it. Does it need to be fixed? How could it be fixed? What are the problems? And so the first is this idea that when children, especially young children, have adverse experiences, it is, and this is a metaphorical model. So when people talk about that, they use metaphors of kind of weight and pushing down and pressure. That when young children face adversity, it puts a weight on them and keeps them from progressing and proceeding through a normal process of development. So adversity is this heavy thing which sits on people and impedes their normal progress and movement. So if you are someone who is experiencing significant adversity, that weight keeps you from having, and I'm going to use this kind of word in quotes, a normal childhood. And if you have people thinking about adversity in this way, there is kind of this mixed kind of plus and minus implication of this way of thinking. First of all, it allows people to see in a very powerful way that adversity is a significant experience, and that experiencing adversity as a young child is something of consequence. I think that's a good thing. People are really easily able to see that as important. On the negative side, if you think that the experience of adversity keeps you from being normal, keeps you from having a normal childhood through which you progress to a normal adult, you start to see, and we'll go back to this again and again, you start to see some of the origin of what I can tell you and what you all know is significant stigma and stereotypes that exist for children who are experiencing adversity and particularly are in or have been in the system. The next is this sense which is kind of created to this weight of worry way of understanding that once a child has experienced a significant event or events of adversity, they are kind of broken and forever damaged. Another way of thinking about this is kind of, and people actually use this metaphor kind of damaged goods, damage done is damage done. And I think this one is more kind of clearly and unequivocally negative. If you think the experience of adversity mars and scars you forever, it is very easy to see how folks with these experiences are so easily viewed as kind of others and broken. So this is, as at this point now, this is quite negative in its implications. There are some ways of thinking, I will tell you, and we'll get to them, that I think are more positive and that you can potentially tap into. The other one, which is really interesting because it is in direct conflict with what I just said, which is a really important feature of how people think. So this is my, here's a soapbox, I'll put it up here, I'll get on it for a second. This is my big problem with survey research, so with public opinion research. So when you do public opinion research and surveys, you come to this idea that people think in this way, that this group or this person thinks in this way. And I think that that is absolutely completely false, is that everybody, always on all issues, has multiple ways of thinking. So the same person that we're talking with, who can think about kind of forever damaged in one sentence, can also think about this sense of young kids are resilient, right? They don't really remember these things, especially when they're very young. They don't have real emotions yet, so they can actually experience a lot of bad you-know-what and come out totally fine, because children are these resilient, kind of unremembering beings. The same person, in the span of 2 paragraphs in a transcript, can evidence both of these models. Unfortunately, I think this one is kind of, while it sounds positive, I think it's actually quite a challenge in the work that you all are doing. So if you think that children are these unbreakable, resilient, springy things, then it's very difficult to see that the adversity that they experience is significant for later outcomes that may be experienced. In terms of how people think about development, there is this is the overwhelming kind of response whenever you ask someone about kind of how children develop or individual differences, is that, so I previously called this the kind of snowflake model, but there's, I guess, another meaning of that in your domain. But it's this assumption that every child is infinitely unique. This kind of postmodern sense that nothing, you can't say anything common about any kid because they're all different. And in a way, I think this is one of these mixed ones. In a way, that's good. Like, you all talk a lot about the complex individual needs of each and every person who is experiencing the system and the need to apply a very individualized approach to the provision of care. And I think people can get there and realize that really easily. There is a very negative implication of this when you cross that with how people think about the care system, which I'll tell you in a minute. But just kind of remember this every child is unique thing for 1 second, more than a second. The other way, and this is one that, that was referenced in the setup, a really interesting, very deep, kind of logical model that as people become more dependent, which is assumed to happen kind of naturally over time as people age, more independent, that is absolutely synonymous with the need for less care. So it's kind of 3 assumptions. As people grow up, they become less dependent, they become more independent, and as you become more dependent, you require less support. So you can see really easily how this becomes a real challenge for the work in children who are, in young people who are kind of slightly older, or certainly in how people think about the services and kind of wraparound supports that we all, I think, know are important to provide as children begin to kind of age out of the care system. Also a model, I don't think this is in any way shocking or surprising. People have some really negative ways that they think about young people, teenagers, adolescents, in which there is inherent risk-taking that's going on. People are making bad decisions, and the bad decisions that they are making are things for which they are responsible. And you can see that if this is the way that you're thinking about kind of young people as being responsible for their decisions and as kind of inherently making bad decisions, it becomes very easy to hold these individuals responsible for anything and everything that they do. And therefore very easy to dismiss a kind of wider social or collective responsibility. So let's get specific to the care system at this point. And this was kind of surprising, I thought, that the system is really modeled as the antithesis of family. So even in one place where people could acknowledge that there is family-based care as part of the system, they would easily switch to kind of making absolute differentiations between family and then everything else that's non-family is the system. And you can see pretty quickly how that is really limiting of a whole bunch of aspects of the system that people need to understand and understand the importance of. And I think that this is one of the most unfortunate ones, and this is the one that dovetails with that every child is unique model that I talked about in an unproductive way. So people understand the care system as through this kind of mechanized, cold, uniform application of care. One size fits all, kind of undifferentiated approach. So if you think of kids as inherently unique and requiring kind of individualized support, and you see the care system as uniform, cold, and uncaring, what do you think that does? This is a test to see who's still listening to me after all this time. What do you think that does?
It's not going to work.
Yeah. If kids are this way and the system is this way, and the two shall never meet, what do you think people think about the system? It will never work. It can't work. This is one of these, this is the one that's like teachers are the education system. So people, when they talk about the care system, they tend to focus on a very particular part of that experience. They focus on the time when a child is removed from a family and directly enters the system. And I'd say that 90% of the conversations in these interviews about the care system, when people are asked open-ended ways, focus on that one event, focus on that one particular circumstance. And they don't see that circumstance as a particularly positive thing. So if people are thinking about the whole system through this one negative prototype, having any conversations about positive things that occur in that system, about support that is provided, are very difficult to have. And finally, and this one was a little bit more what we call recessive, so we didn't see it across all the interviews, people could kind of switch off of it, was a kind of an individualized perspective that the problems with the system are that there are a few people who are either willfully negligent, who aren't doing their job intentionally, or kind of lack the training and perspective that is required to do good work in providing care to young people. As a kind of summative exercise, it's really interesting to look at the kinds of things that we saw in our early work you all want to be able to communicate, the ideas that you want to get across, and you compare them to what I've just taken you through. You compare them to how people think about these issues. You see really clearly and conspicuously a set of gaps where the things that you want to say, the ideas that you want to communicate, do not map on or match up with the way that people are thinking. So the first is kind of this orientation of the system. So you all do and want to talk essentially about a child-centered and caring system. People think about the system in the exact opposite way, as a uniform, cold, undifferentiated, machine-like thing that provides the kind of same basic level of care to all who come in contact with them. There's also a really important difference in terms of the goal of the system. So you all have a developmental, supportive perspective, which it's not surprising. And when people think about the goals of the system, it's really narrowly around not kind of care and nurturing, but protection and material needs. Those are the things that people think the system is able to provide. Children in care, you all have a kind of what I would call, tapping into the science of plasticity, that adversity is significant, but change is always possible for everyone. Outcomes can be improved. And unfortunately, pulling on some of those models that we showed earlier on, there's a definite strong sense of irreparable, permanent damage for those who have care experience. Stigma, so you all recognize the existence and the problem with the way that this system and those who experience are stigmatized. And I think in our interviews we found overwhelmingly that that's true. I mean, your suspicions are warranted. Your concern is founded in how people think about these issues. Early childhood, again, kind of related to the developmental perspective that you all have and want to be able to communicate. Early childhood is a critical time. And then at least employing that resilience model that I talked about, kind of early childhood has having little lasting significant effect. So it's really interesting in the interviews when people were talking about removal of very young children versus removal of older children. Removal of older children was seen to have these horrible, detrimental, forever effects, whereas for a young child, it was seen as something they wouldn't remember and therefore wouldn't really have consequence. Adolescence, a lot of the discussion that you all have in the field is around children, kind of what we in the United States, I don't know if you use the same term, transition age youth, kind of children young people as they transition out of the system and kind of what happens as there's a major gap between the kind of end of the system and the start of other systems. And using that dependence care inverse relationship that we talked about, adolescence as being kind of relatively independent, requiring minimal, if any, support. Inadequate care in the home, this is the kind of how you think about parenting. What we would call kind of a social determinants perspective that you all have, that parenting is this thing that is influenced by a variety of factors that are outside of a parent's control, and kind of individual responsibility and moral failing on the part of the public. Social costs, you don't have to look at many of the materials that are coming out of the sector to know that this is a dominant part of the story that you want to tell, that these are not just issues that involve those who are involved in care, but rather that they have these social impacts and consequences, and in addressing it, benefits, and really as being out of mind for members of the general public. And then finally, and I think as we move forward into the afternoon's discussion, this seems to be a major one. If you are starting this conversation with people who fundamentally believe that improvements are impossible, it is a difficult discussion for you to have. So, emerging recommendations. So what are we, when we think about the way that people think, kind of initially the ways the media and the sector are communicating, what does this tell us about what we should be thinking about and doing? I think that the first recommendation is that you all should be telling more stories. And if you're not telling stories, you're not taking advantage of this most fundamental and powerful feature of cognition, of how people make meaning. Secondly, I think there is a real importance and a role for making people, and I don't mean this in a patronizing way, making people a little bit smarter about some basic principles of the science of early childhood development and adolescent development that allows people to kind of get past either damaged forever or utterly unbreakable. Right? There's an important, neither one of those is wrong, but neither one of those is right alone. I think there's that very first model that I talked about, that weight of worry model. I think there is some positive potential in there to really make adversity a salient issue, but the second move that you must make if it's going to be positive is the introduction of this principle of plasticity. That while adversity is heavy, it need not be bad outcomes for everyone forever. And finally, to find ways of emphasizing the power and importance of family, but in a way that doesn't denigrate non-family care that is and can be productive and important for many folks who are in and experiencing the system. So with that, I always like to end with a quote. Here's my new favorite quote these days about framing. It's from a philosopher in the U.S. Who's kind of the father of the brand of philosophy that's called pragmatism. Richard Rorty, who says, "A talent for speaking differently rather than arguing well is the chief instrument of cultural change." We will not change any of these cultural beliefs by arguing against them. The challenge is to give people new stories that provide them with new ways of thinking without activating the kind of less productive ways that I've laid out.